Yeah.
Come up to the lab and see what's on the slab. I see you shiver with anticipation.
Good afternoon. Magento PWA Studio is a tool for creating and maintaining Magento 2 storefronts as progressive web apps. Didn't that feel good? Hi folks, I'm James Zetlen, and I am going to talk to you guys after each one of your brains has been exquisitely just wrung dry by all of these great presentations and the mountains of content in there. So I promise you that I can probably do this with about the 30% of your attention that you have remaining. So don't worry, this isn't going to be very code heavy, even though some of you might want it to be. There is a project going on inside Magento, if you have not yet heard much about it, called Magento PWA Studio, PWA for Progressive Web Apps. I've blogged a little bit about it, I've hinted a little bit about it, and we're doing a lot of kind of low-level skunk works, fill a whiteboard, erase it, fill it again type of activity. But I'm also getting a lot of concerned questions from people, and many of those concerns are really important and ought to be addressed soon so that people can start kind of making strategic decisions about what this thing is and kind of what place it's going to take in our ecosystem. So here's some questions that I've heard about PWA Studio. It is not a new release of Magento. It's not going to come out in 2.4 or 2.5 and you're not going to be required to upgrade to it. It's not a replacement for all of our front ends. We have no plans to sunset any of our existing tools, except I think maybe I'm going to try to get rid of Prototype pretty soon, if that's cool with everyone. But other than that, we are trying to support the things that we have. We believe in the things that we have. This is a different thing. It's also not a desktop application. I recognize the name Studio is a little worrisome for folks who don't want to download some big thing, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It's really not that different, and it's not a thing you got to download. And it's also, for those of you are several times bitten and extremely shy, it's not a new thing we made up. We haven't plugged a bunch of things together in a way that none of them recognize, which we'll talk about a little bit more too. So okay, I should probably tell you something about what it is. I would say it represents a promising direction, certainly, I'll admit, for all Magento front ends in general, though right now it's focused on the storefront. I think it represents a sensible standard for PWA development on Magento. Now, given the tenor of my presentation so far, these seem like pretty cautious statements, but you'll see why. Because it's kind of the whole point of things like this. And lastly, it's a suite of tools to help developers do the things that you do when you're making a progressive web app. Now, it's a promising direction because progressive web apps, as I think I've discussed in tiresome detail with many of you, they're not really a new fun thing that you can do as a distraction, a new spiffy web technology. They're not Flex, they're not web audio. It really is a neat keyword for the way that you ought to do websites going forward. Now that we know what the mobile internet is, now that we know what the browsers are going to be capable of and how that's going to scale on our devices. It's the way to do things. Headless Magento, such as it is, such as it's worrisomely called, is going to be a standard, I think. A lot of people have already blazed that trail. We don't claim that we're teaching it. Just that it would be nice to standardize upon it, and that's what we intend to do. And we're going to use open standards to do it. Again, not making up some kind of transmission protocol. You might have seen that Felix showed that the API messages for order management are all done over JSON RPC. They're all heavily specified and they're all open. And though we can open our APIs, sometimes we don't adhere to pre-existing specs, and that's something that we have to get better and better at. And we need to respect the scalable infrastructure needs of today's type of deployment and type of DevOps person. And this is something that allows you to do that because of its layered architecture. Because mobile growth is the only growth, and I actually went and commissioned a chart to be made. This is some custom graphics that I got made for mobile growth. I actually got this chart about mobile growth put into Unicode because of my connections. Some of you have seen these slides, and I presented these a little while back, and these slides are meant, again, as an overview of the sensible architecture that we have chosen. Now, you heard earlier from Shane about React and Redux and how they interoperate, so I'm not going to go into great detail there. Also, there's red lights eventually that are going to ruin my eyes, along with that crazy high-pitched noise. Who else? Who else is hearing that? Okay, apparently that's a fire alarm?
No.
Okay, it's an exit sign? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing a thing. Okay. Well, I want to emphasize that because we're not overhauling all of Magento and you're going to have to learn a bunch of changes, you probably might wonder, well, why and how? And here is an attempt to clear that up a little bit. A lot of the things about our architecture that are still completely unchanged are part of the good, great, standard PWA architecture of the future. We already have a separate API layer. We already have a separate controller and concern for our front-end expression. We already have a good starting point in the form of blocks to begin expressing a progressive web app as a view. We have our core logic pretty well separated off. Magento 2 has done a great job of setting the stage for all these things, certainly long before I arrived. We're just adding a few things on top which enhance the experience through new browser features. And so the stuff on top we should probably zoom in on. I would say that this is a lot smaller than I wanted it to be, but this is kind of an overview of why we think such an architecture has the capability to be a good progressive web app, the capability to feel like Magento, and the capability to scale and be extensible. So it's progressive because this architecture as it is designed to start from an application shell, a core tenet of progressive web apps, that you push only the critical assets, and that includes the basic stuff, the branding, and then also a table of initial routes for the likely next steps you're going to take with the logic that loads the new seed bundles to get you there. And that's something we're building into the app shell today. And then the next step is to make sure that we've extended the standard router mechanisms in the JavaScript community of React Router and other things, so that they can progressively load smoothly as you navigate through the site. And once that's load is complete, then the Redux store and the React component tree load and interoperate together to do a full render onto the DOM. And then the DOM emits events, and the events turn into actions, and the actions get read by Redux in those developer tools you saw earlier. It's pretty cool, super testable, and it all runs regular old AJAX requests, which get amalgamated by the service worker into cool calls to the composite query API, yeah, GraphQL. The point is composite query API, so that you can get really, really fast and really, really narrow network band operation and still have your app feel fantastic. And none of those things are really mind-blowing. I mean, if you have worked on a React app, then that architecture might look somewhat familiar to you. You know, maybe I put a couple more arrows in it. But the point is not that we're the brilliant geniuses who are going to crack this case. It's that you guys have been begging, quite rightfully, for just a sensible standard for us to agree upon, and for a number of really good reasons. We've already built a number of great PWAs on Magento, some of them using technologies that are a little edge, that we don't think we could support en masse. But they're still wonderful, and we don't think ours is better by default. It's just that ours can be, because of the position, an agreed upon starting point. And the great thing about agreed upon starting points is that if you have some good, generic, useful e-commerce UX patterns, you can begin reusing them. Because if they follow a convention, then you can extend them. And extensibility is a core part of Magento. Obviously not to the point where you get a gigantic hell tower of XML like you saw recently, but you want to make things extensible, and so our product has to do that. And in fact, in the diagram we just showed, there are a lot of extension opportunities. A lot of the basic structures of a React app are extensible because they're modular. You can add reducers, you can add components, you can add a registered route, and you can even add behaviors to the service worker using the tools that make those behaviors into kind of middlewares. So we know that this architecture that we've chosen and are starting to iterate on has things that, again, keep it a fast, progressive web app, but also make it Magento. But of course, then that's blending things. And once you blend things, you need a tool chain to keep them organized. So why did I call it a studio? It had to do with a notion that I saw that was developing in the front-end community around the correct workflow. This is a bunch of folks, many of whom in this room kind of share their conviction that integrated development environment, big iron programs like Eclipse and even like PHP Storm sometimes. They feel too heavy. I want to use an editor and a few simple tools that do one thing well. And I actually think Studio describes that fairly well, because lots of things can be a studio. Sure, this can be a studio, but it's not going to be Visual Studio 2002. There's a lot of different kinds of studios. It's not going to be this one. Sorry. And it's this kind of studio which should give you the hint that a studio is not something that you buy and install like Microsoft suggested. Because this is also a studio and it does essentially the same type of work. So is this. That's my house. I live there. And that's also a studio. And that's a studio that all of us use all the time. Because a studio is actually a starting point that grows into your ideal workspace. Functionally, in the real world, it's a room that you start putting tools in. And the tools and the transitions between those tools, to the point where you roll your chair to the right, back to the left. Those are the things that you end up optimizing just as a human being building your perfect workspace. So if we give you those good UI building blocks, data connectors, both at runtime and in your own dev tools, and we give you good build, good analysis, good testing, good extension mechanisms, and it's obvious kind of how they all lock together because each tool has a useful API and UI by itself. They make sense individually and together. Well, you might end up with a really cool API. And this is a preview. We're not publishing this. We're not publishing this today. Also, it's not super readable. Sorry about that. But this is an example of one idiom that exists in the React.js world that you can sometimes do inline and sometimes do in a couple of files. And in it, we're going to try to illustrate that we are listening to what people in the Magento development community expect and what people in the React development community are accustomed to. We talked about extensibility, and at one point we were going to put like a little container element around a bunch of stuff. So really, at no point when you're writing React does it ever escape your attention that you are working on Magento, and we don't want it to feel that way. We want it to feel like writing in your favorite tool and your favorite framework, even when you're writing something that's going to be extensible. So in this example, we have a PWA connector that comes out of a namespace that won't be called example in real life, and it has some basic utilities for extensibility. It wraps the constructors for the things we want to turn into blocks, and it assigns them to a little collection of blocks, and then we use those instead. They get names, and then later, extension can target them because this is a standard practice that can be addressed at build time. There's a connect component, and that, if you're familiar with React Redux, is a way of declaring that this thing needs to be tied into the running Redux store at runtime, and this is the data that is relevant to it, a selector for it. And then there's the preload, which obviously will do something with the service worker. The point is you don't have to think about it, but you can say, I'll preload gallery image. And you can put it all together into a React component, and you might see that the Magento stuff is kind of up at the top and down at the bottom. And in the middle, it's React. You've seen this before. Keeping it separate. Keeping it separate on your plate. But perhaps an even more robust way of doing this is by having two files, one of which does all of the pure view. In a system that, in React and in other systems, they like to describe this pattern as presentational and container components. On the left, we have something that really is just React. The only concession it's made to running inside a weird system is that it collects some of its subcomponents as constructors at runtime from some properties that were given to it. That's one line, this props blocks. And the rest of it just feels just like React. It has no idea where it's getting its arguments from, which is great. If you can work with things like that, then you can pull them in from the vast ecosystem of React components, which it's a little like jQuery plugins, except good a lot of the time. And if you can do that, then you've really halved a lot of the work that you can do. You can work at a higher level. You can work at a higher level of abstraction. You can go over here and decide how you're going to contain the components, because this just abstracts all of that Magento-specific API stuff, which I just kind of made up anyway and may change, into a separate place. And this is where you turn the product tile, which is a perfectly serviceable UI, into one that's plugged into the store. So I didn't make up this pattern. This is actually just us amalgamating a bunch of recognized patterns. That's the React Redux connector. This is container idea that comes from us. This is something that comes from Workbox. You just put them all together and say, here's where they ought to go. We may not be done with this because we're in kind of an inner loop of iterating on how to make it feel the best. Because we know that you're in an inner loop of iterating on how to get your projects out the door, on how to learn the things that you need to learn. Inner loops don't get a lot of respect. Not in my experience, anyway. Developer tools, we don't talk about it, but they have APIs. You know, we know that because we use them. Fairleaks maintains one. It's good. And what does API stand for? Application Programming Interface, okay. So it is an interface, but we're the ones using it. We're developers, not users. Developers are users, though. We're actually users. And so that means APIs are actually user interfaces. But when you have a user interface, that means user interfaces needs user experience to be done on them. Is that done? Do we have UX people who look at APIs and the names and the way that you call them? Architects can do it to some extent, but we really like just large systems sometimes, and we should be talked off the ledge. A UX person would be great there because when there's already something that UX has happened to, like Redux or React, you don't want to mess around with it and get in the way of the good tools because developers are users, and users need you to get out of the way of their tools because ultimately users are just going to use. We're trying to listen to lots of different kinds of users as a company, as Magento. We have to be cognizant that there are some who feel ignored, not just because the tools aren't up to their standards today, but because on a fundamental level they're not feeling that feedback loop of being listened to as a user, not as like a business partner, you know, we'll get along, like you'll just deal with it, right? No, you're a user. We write software for users. We know they're jerks. It's our turn. So that's how we're focusing the development cycle so far for Magento PWA Studio. You're eventually going to see some repos, and the process, like I said, involves a lot of writing on whiteboards and erasing it and thinking about what sucks and then making it and then discovering that it sucks and throwing it away, because we need to make a set of tools that all make sense on their own, where it's obvious how to lock them all together, and where at the end of the day, when you're putting them together, you're using user interfaces with good experience that make sense to you right out the gate. Now, I'm not going to claim to be at all the first person to think about users along these lines. I think everyone individually does, but as a community, as a company, we've definitely had some tendencies, I think, that are just structural, to prioritize lots of extensibility and lots of use cases. One of the first companies to even make a significant e-commerce dent in parts of the world where internationalization was like a non-trivial issue, where left to right was a non-trivial issue. We know that we have done good things because of our tendency to put the whole kitchen sink in. And we know that something gives, and always what gives is the developer experience. Eventually you have to rock that boat to the other side. So we're going to talk to you guys, and the users who we're talking about here are developers, and that's a lot of different kinds of developer. People who only write CSS, you're developers. Honestly, people who write layout in their text boxes are developers. And merchant developers are a real class of user that we need to speak to. So you'll be hearing from us, we'll be calling you, and you can call us. But the ultimate driver of what Magento PWA Studio is not the market going mobile, it's not these things are cool, it's not old Magento 2, whatever. It's that we have a general need to address our users more directly and more constantly when they're developers. And we pledge to do that. And we know that you're going to have to help us, because when we talk to you, you have to talk back. And we would appreciate your patience and your continued goodwill while you do that, while we build some mind-blowing tools. So, thank you. Oh, did we turn that back up just in time to not hear patient? Okay, this is available online. I'll be sending it out, and now is the time for questions. I didn't ever get a light, so was this actually really short, or did they just give up?
You're good. You got time.
All right, fantastic. So, any questions? Shoot.
Browser support for PWA.
Say again?
Browser support for PWA.
Browser support for PWA. Oh, yeah. Since we last spoke, there have been a few developments in the trunk for WebKit. They now have a PR that is supposed to be merged and supposed to be into mainline and release pretty soon. So that means that Safari on iOS ought to have service worker support, since it's going to be in the browser engine that it uses. There's, I think, some legit concern that Apple's holding back for like not great reasons, business reasons. But I don't think they can get away with it. App stores, as a model, don't sustain super well. We found, and the sort of long tail of like single store web app, mobile apps is just not. It's not going to go on forever. So I think the pressure will mount for Apple if they're really trying to be bad about it. But other browsers that don't fully support PWA concerns are very rare these days. You know, even Internet Explorer itself is down to a vanishing few number of folks, and they're not on the mobile device that really needs the experience anyway. So what we think about instead of browser support is device capability. We want the PWA to run on a version of Chrome that has all of the right features, but that has just no space left. It has no network connection, and it has no processor's power. That's what we got to think about. Anything else?
There's one up there.
Oh, hello.
Hi. One of the biggest problems in Magento 2 at the moment is the fact that all the dependency management happens on the client at runtime.
Yeah.
Is this something you're going to move into the build system, and are you going to allow like extensions to load code dynamically at runtime?
Can you repeat that for the?
Yeah, I can repeat that out. So the question was, it's easy to observe that Magento 2 right now by default uses require.js, and so it does a lot of runtime work to assemble all the dependencies that a given page needs. Sometimes there's this waterfall where you don't know the next layer until they've loaded. It's terrible. So are we moving in the direction of fixing that, for one thing? And then the other part of the question was, sorry.
I forgot now.
See? This is, I'm the last one, and no one's awake. I'm not. So yeah, I will answer that one directly, which is that we are going to do bundling. Now, in progressive web app literature, there is actually some discussion about whether bundling will be necessary down the line because of things like HTTP2 and whatever. But if you're going to do HTTP2 push, you already have to have a bunch of headers put together. So some back-end work is necessary, and since it's invariant over many users, there's really no reason not to build it. So we will continue to have bundling. It will be Webpack, but we're not going to make that thing too complicated. I think we're going to try to keep that real simple, and Webpack lets you tweak the size of the chunks that it produces and the number of possible chunks. And those are those two kind of dials that you can tweak as a developer and then watch as your performance changes in its characteristics. We'd like to have those dials available. So we're going to have Webpack, and that means that at runtime you will have no dependencies that haven't already been analyzed, and so they'll come in bundles. But your question was also like, if you do that, then what happens to the need for dynamic injection of dependencies? And more recent versions of Webpack fix that by, well, Webpack had a non-standard API called ensure, which lets you kind of declare that some part of the bundle was asynchronous, and in doing so, then you could have like a dynamically resolved string that was in there that you required on. There is a new specification, which is not yet as solid as imports, which is the system import, or the import function, which returns a promise for the module. And that's eventually going to be standard, and right now Webpack respects that as a break for bundles too. So you will be able to get both, and we're just going to try to keep it as convenient as it is while slimming down the bundles. It's a good question. Hey, is it as good as that one? All right, let's hear it.
What kind of Node.js server are you going to use to serve up these PWA apps? Do you guys settle on the thing, or you just leave that open to whoever's running it?
The question was, what kind of Node.js server are you going to use to serve the PWA apps? Which seems like was that kind of a lob for me? Because no, we're not going to serve it on Node. We're not going to serve the PWAs on Node.js servers, not by default anyway. We have this notion that we're already going to be pushing a lot of ideas on folks if they want to move to this method of development. So we considered, do we have like an actual separate web app layer that would be like Node, and that would allow for a bunch of stuff. SSR would be easier. Ultimately, it just seemed like way too much change, and the PHP front controller is perfectly adequate to the purpose and already has the plumbing to render the data that you need in the SSR layer. So the build process, yeah, Node, because like that's the standard for the tools, and we'll support whatever LTS, so 6, 8, you know, whatever it is. But at runtime, no Node, I don't think. Totally. Good question. And the follow-up was, PHP is pretty heavy, and there's ways that it's quite inefficient compared to Node, especially for concurrent connections, which is true. And are we going to let that happen or allow it as an option? And the right answer is we haven't thought about how to pave that part of the road, but it's open. You can. Again, we're not building this as a part of Magento. It's going to be more of an add-on or a bundled extension or an extension that supplies the tooling environment and also the headless implementation and configure set. So, you know, like any extension, you can rip it out and replace parts of it. And we'll try to write it in a way that's modular enough to do so. But, you know, that's no different from the way things are today. That's why people can make great headless Magento apps today. To your point about which language is more efficient, I think under some circumstances you're absolutely right, under most maybe, but we have a room in a community full of people who are very accustomed to optimizing and speeding up PHP applications. And all that they need to do is serve up the sort of the initial app shell and then, you know, manage to make API requests fast and small. And those aren't things that I think Node gives you such a leg up in that we demand people use it, you know? I mean, yeah, you're entitled to the opinion. That's the point. You can make it. So, it's a good question, though. Yeah. Anyone else? I feel like it's been kind of righty. Maybe you guys haven't heard me because of the train. Should I do the whole thing again, but walk over here? Apparently. There's like, okay, well, now we have a red light. So. No one? Okay, get ready for some more blog posts. Since y'all said on Twitter that's how you want to hear from me. Thank you very, very much, everyone. And thank you for helping me out with the ridiculous entrance. Thanks to Ben Marks. Ben Marks, people. You turn the applause back up when I say Ben Marks.